The Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic, a smallish region along the border with Romania, had been making noises about declaring independence for some time, especially since the February 1990 elections, when the Popular Front of Moldova, allied with the reforming wing of the Communist Party, took power, affirmed Moldovan as the official language of the Republic, and in April the Supreme Soviet had changed the SSR's official flag to a blue-red-yellow tricolour, reflecting the people's cultural and linguistic ties with Romania, first with the emblem of the SSR in the centre, and then plain, just like the Romanian flag. It was clear that the movement was towards independence, with some even suggesting that the small state would request union with Romania. But this wasn't a universally popular idea within the Republic, particularly along the eastern fringes, along the Dniester River, on its border with the Ukrainian SSR, and in the city of Tiraspol, where there were more Russian and Ukrainian speakers who were less keen on the idea of independence. After a summer of tensions, in September 1990 a breakaway republic was declared, the Pridnestrovian Moldavian SSR, a long thin strip of land with Tiraspol as its capital, and Russian-born Igor Smirnov as its head of state. But the new republic was not yet recognised by either Moscow or Chisinau, or indeed anyone else. In New Zealand, there was an election coming up in November, and it was looking like the incumbent Labour Party were heading for defeat after 6 years in power, including a range of controversial economic reforms known as Rogernomics after Finance Minister Roger Douglas. The Labour government was facing opposition from the established Conservative National Party and also from a breakaway left-wing party called New Labour, founded by Jim Anderton. Prime Minister Geoffrey Palmer, not that one, was seen as lacking charisma, as well as being too closely associated with Rogernomics, and he was moved aside after just over a year in charge in favour of Mike Moore. Palmer would later recall, "I was actually very pleased to get out at the end of 1990. I was quite happy to run through as PM and take the defeat, but if other people wanted to do it, be my guest." The South Korean President Roh Tae-woo had met Mikhail Gorbachev earlier in the summer, the first official Soviet recognition of the existence of South Korea, the Republic of Korea, to be official. Now, in early September, Roh met the North Korean Prime Minister Yong Hyun-muk in the first top-level talks between the two Koreas since their split in 1945. With great leader Kim Il-sung now over 80, Yon had more leeway than might usually be the case and became an advocate of efforts to reconcile the two Koreas. And these talks in September 1990 would lead to what became known as the South-North Basic Agreement, and seemed to suggest that the 1990s might finally see some progress in the Korean peninsula. And while all that was going on, Presidents Bush and Gorbachev met up in Helsinki to discuss the Persian Gulf crisis. The US had responded to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait by immediately moving troops to the region, but many of the Arab countries in the area had been Soviet client states through the Cold War to counterbalance America's lavish military support of Israel. Behind closed doors, the two discussed a joint response, telling the press afterwards that they were both in agreement that Iraq should comply with the UN resolution calling for peaceful de-escalation, and that both countries were committed to finding a diplomatic solution, but the US forces would stay in the Gulf, quote, as long as is required. After Italian heartbreak in the World Cup in the summer, sports fans flocked to Monza, hoping to see their beloved prancing horse put one over on the hated McLarens. Prost had won 4 races already, and Ferrari usually did well on home tarmac, and while Nigel Mansell was far from being flavour of the month at Maranello, the fans still loved him, and a win here would go a long way to cheering them, and him, up. And they'd also enjoy modernised facilities for spectators, along with upgrades to pit and paddock. The sporting press were expecting an announcement from Ferrari about Prost's teammate for 1991. The latest rumour had Nannini being bought out of his Benetton contract after a series of gutsy drives, but they were to be disappointed as the Maranello press department remained tight-lipped. For his part, Nigel Mansell called a press conference to reiterate that yes, he was definitely retiring from F1 at the end of the season, but was considering going into sports cars. Frank Williams, meanwhile, elaborated on the Jean Alesi transfer situation for the BBC.
Yes, Williams signed a contract with Jean Alesi on the 2nd of February, a proper English law contract, conditional, however, upon his securing a proper and legal release from his present employer, Ken Tyrrell. If that release comes into place, Williams have priority on his services, and I'm sure you are well aware that he would rather drive for Ferrari, which is perfectly understandable. But we got there first, and we intend to stay there first at this moment in time.
while Alain Prost gave his thoughts.
In fact, I can't tell you that will not be very fair for the drivers expecting to be a teammate next year. I have some preference for sure, but the only thing I said, except the preference, I just try to analyze the advantage and disadvantages of the drivers, and then I don't want to take any part of the choice. Just my advice. That's it. I would not like a second driver, you know, because I don't want, especially to be number one, and not number one, number two is not fair. But it can't work in a team like Ferrari. It always don't work in a normal team, but here would be even worse.
Suggesting he didn't want a number two but an equal partner. Apparently he'd suggested Caffey, though Alex professed himself flattered but none the wiser.
No, I never spoke with Ferrari, and but about Senna and Prost, I'm very, very happy because when a big driver, I think the bigger drivers in Formula One at the moment, the driver that wins much more Grand Prix in the world, say this about me is very, very great for me because it's like win a Grand Prix.
If Caffey left Arrows, who would fill his seat? It wasn't a hot ticket exactly, but the prospect of powerful Porsche engines had some people talking, with Arrows' old boy Thierry Boutsen a popular rumour. So did Jackie Oliver have a wealth of options to choose from?
No. There are two things you need to get top drivers. You need a lot of money, you need success. We haven't got the success, we've got the promise of success, and I think the drivers would rather choose the teams that have got current success because that is proven and there's less risk. So we do find ourselves in that situation. But the silly season's not over yet.
There was some Italian-based news, though, with Lamborghini announcing that they were following Camel in cutting ties with Lotus for next year, as well as the LaRousse team, and would instead be supplying Ligier and a new team. Lamborghini had been working on a car for a proposed Mexican entry in F1 called Glass, and even tested with Mauro Baldi at Imola, only for the backer to disappear into thin air. But now Italian industrialist Carlo Petruccio, former boss of Filer who had sponsored Brabham in the 80s, had bought the car and founded Scuderia Modena, based in the Italian city of the same name, for an entry in 1991. So Lotus would be needing to find a new engine supplier as well as a new sponsor. And a new driver too, as Derek Warwick announced that he would be driving silk-cut Jaguars for Tom Walkinshaw next year. Exactly what would be left of Lotus in 1991 was becoming a serious question. For this race, though, both drivers professed themselves happy with the current car after some revisions, while Williams had introduced some new aero tweaks courtesy of Adrian Newey and an updated engine. Ferrari, of course, were giving it maximum effort, with 4 cars and another update to the Supermotore, as the press were calling their new engine. Pre-qualifying saw Guiar top the standings again with revised aerodynamics on the Ozella, followed by Gasho in his best PQ effort yet. The AGSs were next, with the Euro, Bruns and Life missing out once more. Giacomelli got just 3 laps in before the usual blowout this time, but the team were confident they'd have their Judd engine and modified chassis ready for the next race in Portugal. To nobody's surprise, Senna took pole again, but it took him till the dying seconds of Saturday's session. But the Tifosi were encouraged to see Prost on the front row too, 0.4 seconds behind Senna and just 0.001 seconds ahead of Berger, who took third with Mansell fourth. Alesi put in another stonking lap in his relatively underpowered Tyrrell to take fifth, ahead of a slightly deflated Williams pairing who had thought they would do better than 6th and 7th. Next were the Benettons, Nannini ahead of Piquet, who shared row 5 with his fellow countryman Gugelmin in the leading Leighton House. A trio of Lamborghini engines came next, with the Lotuses going much better and Bernard in 13th alongside Nakajima. Modena had a big off when his engine blew, but lined up 17th alongside fellow gravel trap connoisseur Aguri Suzuki. Yannick Dalmas put his AGS in the race in 24th alongside fellow pre-qualifier Guiar, but Tarquini and Gasho would miss out, with Nicola Larini squeaking his Ligier onto the grid ahead of the other AGS by just 0.2, and Paolo Barilla unhappily missing his home race alongside David Brabham. Tyres would be a consideration as usual, with the Goodyear runners choosing between the hardest A compounds and the slightly softer Bs. Ferrari had gone for A's all round, but McLaren covered their bases by making the more aggressive choice of B's for Senna and the more conservative A's for Berger. Williams did the same, with Boutsen on A's and Patrese on B's. All of that decided, the cars lined up and the lights went red, then green, and away they went, with Senna sprinting away on his slightly softer tyres, as Berger went side by side with Prost in a drag race for the first chicane. It was the second McLaren that got the place, while Alesi also nipped ahead of Mansell to take fourth. Boutsen held on to sixth, but Patrese dropped behind Nannini and Gugelmin as everyone got through the Rettifilo successfully. As they headed up to the second chicane, Alesi bushwhacked Prost for third place, while off-camera Patrese had got back ahead of Gugelmin. As they entered the Parabolica at the end of the first lap then, it was the two McLarens, then Alesi and the two Ferraris, but Derek Warwick in 12th got wide, put a wheel on the grass and slammed hard into the Armco at about 160 miles an hour, tipping onto the side of the car and skidding, shedding bits, before coming to rest more or less upside down in the middle of the straight. Miraculously missed by everyone else streaming past, Derek Warwick climbed out of the shattered Lotus and walked away. With the car stuck in the middle of the straight and the exit to Parabolica liberally strewn with debris, the red flag came straight out. Warwick was not only okay, but seemed in pretty good spirits as he sprinted back to the pits to get in the spare Lotus for the restart, laughing and joking with his team and telling anyone who cared to listen that it was entirely his own fault, he'd just got it wrong. Sid Watkins passed him fit to race, and he'd got a new helmet as his old one had a severe case of road rash, and he was ready to go. So back to the grid they all went, with it all to do again, not least Jean Alesi, who'd been having a great first lap and had even been shaping up to pass Berger when the red flag came out. Off they went again, Prost squeezing Berger over this time, but it didn't work. The McLaren had enough room and enough grunt to go into second, while Alesi again got ahead of Mansell, and Patrese got a better start this time to go in Rettifilo, still in his 7th place off the grid. Once again Alesi took third off Prost as they went into the Roger, so at the end of the first lap it was again Senna, Berger, Alesi, Prost, Mansell and Boutsen, and Alesi was hot on the heel of the Austrian and pulling away from Prost. Berger, for his part, was looking for a way past Senna, so the top three were running tight together. And behind the two Ferraris there were two-way scraps between the Williamses and Benettons, Nannini having got past Boutsen and now angling after Patrese's place, while Piquet was hanging on the Belgian's rear wing. Behind them, as the director left the camera running, were Gugelmin 10th, Donnelly 11th, Bernard 12th and Warwick 13th. The McLarens, with Alesi in tow, continued to pull away from the Ferraris, who were in turn pulling away from the Williams-Benetton scraps, until Nannini got ahead of Patrese and started catching up. Alesi, trying just a bit too hard, lost it at the Rettifilo at the start of lap 5 and then stalled, putting himself out as Nannini set a fastest lap as he pursued the Ferraris. Berger still looked like he wanted to get past Senna despite the Brazilian's softer tyres, and certainly the two McLarens were running nose to tail, with Prost now holding steady somewhere between 1.5 and 2 seconds behind Senna, and things had settled down by lap 8 when Martini spun and, despite getting going again, had broken his right rear suspension, so he was out. Bernard was the third casualty with a clutch failure on lap 11, and apparently not too distraught, while all the time the leading three pulled away from Mansell, who it would later transpire had an accelerator pedal that kept sticking down, meaning he had to lever it up with his toe whenever he wanted to brake, and the two Williamses amused themselves with a scrap over the last point with Piquet in tow. Martin Donnelly's Lotus blew up on lap 14, leaving a smoke screen right across the Roger, before parking up next to Bernard's Lola and following the Frenchman's example and giving a cheery wave to the crowd. It was definitely not Lotus's day, as Derek Warwick peeled into the pits a couple of laps later to retire with a dud clutch. By that time the leaders were beginning to lap the first back markers, and Prost had got right onto Berger's gearbox, while Senna had finally begun to put fresh air between himself and his teammate. On lap 21 of the 53, almost exactly half distance, Prost suddenly just drove past Berger going into second Lesmo, raising questions about whether there was something wrong with Berger's car or maybe he'd just missed a gear. In fact, the Austrian's brakes were starting to fade and there wasn't a lot he could do to stop Prost getting past or come back at him, but he was able to stay in touch at least. Mansell, with car issues of his own, had also caught up a bit, so with Senna off in the middle distance to the tune of 8 seconds, it was McLaren, Ferrari in the top 4 places, with Nannini a comfortable 5th but looking unlikely to improve on that at the moment. In fact, Nannini pitted on lap 31 for a new set of Bs, and at the same time Piquet, who'd found he had a puncture, also swept in, and the result was chaos in the Benetton pit, mostly missed by the cameras as Nelson had to wait for Sandro to leave, which took a little bit longer than usual because his clutch was slipping. All of which put Ivan Capelli up to 6th ahead of Nakajima, with the two Benettons now behind the Tyrrell and playing catch-up. Nannini started to find his car was jumping out of gear whenever he braked, which really wasn't helping. Senna, finally, broke his own lap record, set in a turbocharged Lotus Honda back in 1987, as he and Prost continued trading fastest laps, and indeed Prost beat the time on the very next lap. Capelli dropped out of 6th with an engine failure on lap 37, the same problem that had done for his teammate earlier, which promoted Nakajima into the points, while Nannini dropped behind Piquet, who took up the chase of the Tyrrell and the last point. Suzuki pulled over with an electrical problem at about the same time, so that's 0 for 4 on finishes for the Lamborghini engines at their home race, which was now entering its last third. Prost became the first man to lap Monza at over 150 miles an hour, in its current configuration at least, as he continued pushing Senna hard, and the gap was closing, but incrementally slowly, and with just 10 laps to the end now, he just couldn't get closer than about 6 seconds, and Senna kept pulling out a whole second whenever there was a knot of traffic on the road, especially when Prost had to pass Alboreto and De Cesaris, who were having a terrific scrap among themselves and kind of forgot about their wing mirrors. In both 1988 and 89, Senna had been robbed of his lead in the late stages by tripping over Jean-Louis Schlesser, allowing Berger to win in a Ferrari in 88, and blowing an engine to let Ferrari-bound Prost through last year, so the Tifosi were hoping it would be a hat-trick. It wasn't. Senna cruised home to a Grand Slam lights-to-flag victory with fastest lap, the third of his career, with Prost second and Berger third to make up an identical podium to Belgium 2 weeks earlier. Mansell trailed in a lonely 4th, disappointed with his car's performance, but happy at least to record just his 4th finish of the year, with Patrese 5th and Nakajima salvaging a point for Tyrrell after Alesi's early exit. Alboreto spun on the last lap trying to get past De Cesaris, but only actually lost 1 place to Larini by doing so because Alio and Dalmas behind were both multiple laps behind him. 8 in Dalmas's case, meaning he was unclassified, but still the team would be happy to get some test mileage in and record their 3rd finish of the year. After the race, as the top 3 sat down for the press conference, Prost and Senna seemed in good spirits and publicly shook hands, smiled for the cameras and announced that they had officially ended their spat. Senna extended his lead to 16 points, the largest it had been all season, but still far from unassailable, while Mansell's continued reliability woes meant McLaren's constructors' lead was bigger as they crossed the 100-point mark. It was another 3 weeks until the next race at Estoril, with plenty to chew on after what had been ultimately a rather dull race. Not that Senna was complaining.